Have you ever learned history and thought, wait, why does everything sound so dramatic? Heroes always die gloriously. Empires collapse because of moral decay. And everyone keeps quoting legendary lines that tiny problem no one actually ever said. Sound familiar? Congratulations, you're not dumb. You're just a victim of the heavily edited version of history. Real history is basically a group chat that's been running for thousands of years. One person exaggerates, another leaves things out, and somehow nobody ever fact-checks. In this video, we're going to tear apart some of the historical truths humanity has confidently believed its entire life, just to find out who's actually more naive, people back then, or us. Buckle up, because a lot of long-held beliefs are about to get knocked over. 1. If you still believe the pyramids were built by half-starved slaves being whipped under the desert sun, sorry. You've watched way too many primetime movies. The reality of ancient Egypt is a lot more boring. No chains, no angry overseers. Instead, it was organized labor, proper food, housing, supervisors, shifts, and even days off. Yes, it sounds suspiciously like a modern construction site, just without the orange safety helmets. Workers were paid in grain, beer, and garlic, which back then were basically cash. Some work crews even left graffiti bragging about productivity, like, "This team finished faster." Very strong KPI energy. If these people were slaves, no one would have bothered signing their work for history. The pyramids weren't built by brutality. They were built by elite project management, solid logistics, and a workforce that wasn't starving. A little uncomfortable, right? Turns out the secret to building wonders isn't whips, it's organization. In the truly depressing part, they figured this out 4,000 years ago. And a lot of projects today still haven't. 2. The Middle Ages are usually portrayed as a time when everyone feared science, hated knowledge, and was just waiting for an excuse to burn books, and occasionally people. It's a great villain origin story. It's also consistently wrong. In reality, many monasteries were serious research centers. Monks copied manuscripts, studied mathematics, tracked the stars, practiced medicine, and argued about ideas complicated enough to ruin your sleep if you read them at midnight. While the outside world was busy with non-stop wars, monasteries were quiet enough to actually learn. A huge amount of ancient Greek and Roman knowledge didn't disappear. It was preserved, copied, corrected, and passed down by monks. Without them, later Europe would have had to reinvent a lot of things that already existed. Science didn't die in the Middle Ages. It just put on a robe and worked quietly. But since there were no fireworks, no lone geniuses posing under dramatic lighting, the era got labeled dark. History, once again, proves a simple rule. Loud things get remembered. Quiet work gets ignored. 3. The year 476 is often labeled as the day the Roman Empire fell, like the entire world heard a loud crash and the screen instantly went black. In reality, that day was pretty normal. A teenage emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was removed from power. A German general took over, and most Romans kept doing what they always did, going to the market, paying taxes, arguing with neighbors. There were no historical fireworks, no official sign that said empire closed. The system had been weak for a long time. 476 was just the moment someone new started signing the paperwork. Laws stayed in place. Bureaucrats kept their jobs. Money kept circulating. Only the logo on the letterhead changed. But Rome collapsed on a dramatic, fateful day sounds much cleaner than Rome slowly aged, developed chronic problems, and got absorbed into a different system. History loves clear dates because they're easy to teach. Real life hates straight lines. So, 476 became a convenient end button. The empire didn't die. It switched roles. And later audiences mistook a scene change for the finale. 4. When people hear about witches being executed, they immediately picture the Middle Ages, as if everyone back then was running around with torches, hunting people out of pure superstition. The image is so familiar that almost no one stops to ask, wait, when did this actually happen the most? The answer is surprisingly inconvenient. Not the Middle Ages, but the early modern period, when Europe was going through massive upheaval. This was a time of social instability, constant wars, deadly plagues, and collapsing belief systems, right when old certainties were breaking down and new laws hadn't fully formed yet. When people don't understand what's happening around them, they look for something to blame. Witches were a very convenient option. What's even more awkward is that many witch hunts weren't driven directly by the church, but by secular courts, where vague laws met judges under pressure from angry crowds. Medieval society actually had relatively stable legal and religious structures, which meant fewer executions than we like to imagine. But history loves shortcuts. Slap the label Dark Ages on everything, and the story becomes easy. The real lesson is less about superstition and more about fear. Specifically, what happens when societies change too fast and people desperately need someone to carry the blame for their anxiety. 5. Napoleon Bonaparte is remembered as a short, angry general, constantly furious because he couldn't quite reach the doorknob of history. It sounds logical, it's easy to remember, and it's perfect meme material. The problem is, it's wrong. Napoleon wasn't short. He stood around 5'6" 5'7", which actually made him taller than the average European man of his time. Drop him into 19th century Paris, and he wouldn't dominate the room, but he definitely wouldn't need a step stool to give a speech. So how did he get shrunk in collective memory? The answer is simple. British newspapers. When Britain couldn't defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, they did what they were much better at, attacking his image. The nickname Le Petit Caporal, originally affectionate, got twisted into short. And just like that, a propaganda campaign outlived an empire. What's impressive is how many people still believe it without question, because the human brain loves simple stories. Powerful people must be compensating. Short guys must be aggressive. History doesn't always need to be accurate. It just needs to feel psychologically satisfying. And in the end, Napoleon won and lost plenty of battles, but he definitively lost the war over his imaginary height. 6. Et tu, Brute, is probably one of the most famous lines in history, even though the person supposedly saying it likely never did, and the people hearing it definitely didn't write it down. The scene is just too perfect. Julius Caesar, bleeding out, turns to his close friend, delivers one last heartbreaking line, and collapses. If this were a movie, it's where the audience cries. If it's history, it's inconvenient. No Roman historical source records Caesar saying those words. The closest we get are vague accounts, including theories that he may have spoken Greek, or said nothing at all because he was busy getting stabbed. The line, et tu, Brute, is actually the invention of William Shakespeare, a writer so good he managed to overwrite humanity's collective memory. What started as a dramatic flourish in a stage play slowly mutated into a historical fact, quoted in textbooks, carved into art, and repeated without hesitation. It's the perfect reminder that history isn't written only by the winners. It's rewritten by the better storytellers. Caesar may have died in silence, but Shakespeare didn't. And that's why a line from a play has outlived entire Roman records, quietly proving that sometimes what survives history isn't the event itself, but a really good line of dialogue. 7. There's a strangely persistent image of ancient Romans, hosting massive feasts, eating until they physically can't anymore, then casually throwing up just to make room and go back for round 2. It sounds decadent, believable, and just shocking enough to survive for centuries. There's only one small problem. It basically didn't happen. The entire myth comes from a very suspicious-sounding word. Vomitorium. It sounds like vomit, so obviously people assumed vomiting, but a vomitorium was actually just a theater exit, a space designed for crowds to pour out after a performance. It expelled people, not dinner. Romans absolutely threw huge banquets. They ate a lot. They lived extravagantly, but they also had stomachs and biological limits, just like the rest of us. The idea that an entire civilization ran on an eat-vomit-eat industrial system says far more about later storytellers than about Roman habits. Still, the story was too convenient to let go. It's moral, it's judgmental, and it neatly proves that decadence leads to collapse. So a linguistic misunderstanding slowly turned into a historical fact. History, it turns out, works a lot like office gossip. If it sounds right, it doesn't have to be right. It just has to be repeatable. 9. Samurai are usually remembered as the ultimate symbol of loyalty. Die before betraying your lord, honor above life itself, and never once ask whether this month's pay cleared on time. It's a clean, elegant image, and incredibly convenient for movies. Reality, however, is messier. Samurai were a professional military class, and like all professionals, they needed land, stipends, and benefits to survive. When a lord lost a war, ran out of money, or could no longer protect his followers, switching sides wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Many samurai changed allegiances, signed new agreements, and kept fighting for whoever paid better. Sound familiar? Right. Very much like high-end mercenaries, except the contract was written in honor instead of on paper. The ideal of loyalty unto death was heavily emphasized later, when Japan wanted to promote an image of discipline and moral purity. Some samurai really did die for honor, but many others lived very long lives by being flexible. History prefers beautiful deaths to practical decisions because they're more romantic. But if every samurai had chosen death the moment their lord fell, Japan would have run out of warriors remarkably fast. 9. Samurai are usually remembered as the ultimate symbol of loyalty. Die before betraying your lord, honor above life itself, and never once ask whether this month's pay cleared on time. It's a clean, elegant image, and incredibly convenient for movies. Reality, however, is messier. Samurai were a professional military class, and like all professionals, they needed land, stipends, and benefits to survive. When a lord lost a war, ran out of money, or could no longer protect his followers, switching sides wasn't betrayal, it was survival. Many samurai changed allegiances, signed new agreements, and kept fighting for whoever paid better. Sound familiar? Right. Very much like high-end mercenaries, except the contract was written in honor instead of on paper. The ideal of loyalty unto death was heavily emphasized later, when Japan wanted to promote an image of discipline and moral purity. Some samurai really did die for honor, but many others lived very long lives by being flexible. History prefers beautiful deaths to practical decisions because they're more romantic. But if every samurai had chosen death the moment their lord fell, Japan would have run out of warriors remarkably fast. 10. The Great Wall of China is usually imagined as a massive, towering barrier so intimidating that any invading cavalry would see it and immediately turn around in despair. It sounds heroic, fits the name perfectly, and is very easy to believe. There's just one problem. It didn't really work that way. The wall is long, yes, but it isn't continuous. It wasn't always guarded, and it could be crossed, bribed, or simply walked around. Nomadic armies managed to enter China plenty of times while the wall was still standing. So why build it at all? Because its main purpose wasn't stopping armies. It was management. The wall helped control trade, collect taxes, monitor migration, and define zones of influence. In other words, it was a massive administrative system built out of stone and dirt. It didn't block every invasion, but it was very good at knowing who was crossing, why they were crossing, and whether they'd paid the fee. That may not sound very epic, but it's extremely practical. Unfortunately, giant border management system doesn't inspire much pride, while legendary military wonder does. So history picked the version that sounds better. And just like that, a tool for economic control became a symbol of unbeatable defense, at least in our imagination. 11. Marie Antoinette is probably the most unfairly quoted woman in history. Let them eat cake sounds perfectly arrogant. Custom made to turn her into the ultimate symbol of royal indifference. There's just one issue. She never said it. The line was already floating around in satirical writings before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France, basically a political meme from the pre-internet era. When France plunged into crisis, the monarchy needed a face people could hate, and she was ideal. Young, foreign, fashionable, and completely lacking a PR team. So an old quote got pulled off the shelf, slapped onto the right person at the right moment, and went viral. Wow, 18th century style. It was simple, memorable, and incredibly effective at whipping up public anger. The truth is less exciting. She wasn't stupid enough to say it, and she wasn't powerful enough to control everything anyway. But history, like social media, prefers short quotes over complicated context. And just like that, a sentence she never spoke outlived an entire dynasty, becoming a textbook example of how being hated at the wrong moment matters more than being right. 12. When people think of Sparta, they usually picture lean, hardened warriors living off bland food, embracing hardship, and existing solely for war. It's a great motivational poster, and it conveniently skips a pretty great detail. Sparta had an elite class that lived very comfortably. While the warriors trained brutally, Spartan elites owned vast lands and relied on a massive population of enslaved workers, the helots, to do all the actual labor. That arrangement freed them up to train brutally and cultivate an image of discipline. In other words, Sparta's famous simple lifestyle was heavily subsidized by forced labor. The communal meals everyone loves to talk about sounded equal on paper, but wealth and power were anything but evenly distributed. Sparta wasn't a society of poor people choosing hardship. It was a system where a small group could afford iron discipline because they didn't have to worry about farming. But warriors who live simply sounds nobler than elites living well because someone else does the work. So history picked the version that's easier to admire. And just like that, a deeply unequal society got rebranded as the ultimate symbol of discipline and sacrifice. 13. In pop culture, pirates always come with a shovel, a deserted island, and a buried chest of gold marked by a badly drawn map. It sounds romantic, adventurous, and incredibly impractical. In reality, pirates rarely bury treasure because burying money is the worst possible use of money when there's a good chance you'll be hanged next week. Most pirates lived short lives, died quickly, and spent their loot even faster. Whatever gold or silver they stole was usually split immediately and traded for rum, food, weapons, or anything that might keep them alive for a few more voyages. Treasure sitting underground can't buy you anything, especially when you're not confident you'll survive long enough to come back and dig it up. The whole buried treasure idea comes from 18th and 19th century novels, where writers needed something mysterious to keep the plot moving. It turned pirates from armed criminals into layered adventure characters. But real pirates didn't think long-term like that. They weren't investors. They were high-risk workers with extremely short career spans. And in that situation, the smartest financial strategy isn't saving for later. It's spending everything now, before history even has time to learn your name. 14. You've probably heard that people in ancient times died incredibly young, that making it to 30 already counted as old, as if humanity once lived on a free trial. The number itself isn't fake, but the way it's understood is wildly wrong. Average life expectancy was low, mainly because a huge number of children didn't survive early childhood. Once you made it past that extremely dangerous stage, living into your 60s, or even 70s, was entirely possible. In other words, the ancient world wasn't a place where everyone died young. It was a place where being a child was incredibly risky. Adults still worked, had families, fought over property, and aged in the very literal sense. But averages don't care whether someone died at 1 year old or 70. They just drag everything down into a depressing number. Later generations took that statistic and retold it as if everyone back then lived short, miserable lives, which conveniently makes modern times look more advanced. The reality is less dramatic. Ancient people didn't lack longevity. They lacked antibiotics, sanitation, and a bit of luck at birth. And ironically, the most dangerous thing in the ancient world wasn't old age. It was being born in the first place. 15. Calling the Middle Ages the Dark Ages feels great, like slapping offline mode on an entire millennium. But if it was really that dark, who exactly built universities, wrote legal systems, practiced medicine, and left behind piles of books for the future to keep using? While we imagine everyone doing nothing but praying and trying not to get burned at the stake, Europe's first universities were popping up. Roman law was being systematized, doctors were recording case notes, and scholars were debating ideas complicated enough to make you close the video, out of self-defense. The Middle Ages didn't hate knowledge. They just didn't have electricity, Wi-Fi, or a marketing department. Compared to the flashy Renaissance that came later, they looked less glamorous, so they got labeled dark. But calling the Middle Ages dark is like calling a library a warehouse just because it's quiet. History loves spotlights. Foundation work rarely gets applause, and it turns out a lot of what we're proud of today was built by people we've casually dismissed as backward. 16. When people hear the Aztecs, what usually pops into their heads is human sacrifice, blood everywhere, and a civilization that existed solely to kill people for the gods. It's shocking, it's horrifying, and it fits perfectly into the story told by the conquerors. The problem is, it's only a tiny slice of the picture. The Aztecs built massive cities, engineered highly efficient agricultural systems, developed precise calendars, advanced mathematics, and ran an incredibly complex society. But none of that is as easy to tell as sacrifice rituals. When the Spanish arrived, they needed a moral justification for conquest, and portraying the Aztecs as savage was the perfect solution. Killing people sounds bad. Killing barbarians sounds like salvation, so history got edited in the most convenient direction. The irony is that at the same time Europe was torturing prisoners, executing people in public, and fighting endless wars, yet somehow never labeled itself barbaric. Turns out history isn't written only by the winners. It's shaped by which details the storytellers decide to highlight. And if you control the story, you don't have to be innocent. You just have to look civilized. 17. If you picture samurai marching onto the battlefield with gleaming katanas, hair flowing in the wind, slicing enemies like it's a movie trailer, sorry, that's the poster version, not reality. On an actual battlefield, the katana was closer to an expensive accessory. The real work was done by bows and spears. The reason is painfully simple. Fighting from a distance is safer, more effective, and results in fewer heroic deaths in the first 5 minutes. A bow lets you take someone down before they ever reach you. A spear keeps distance, holds formation, and doesn't require you to charge in like an action movie extra. The katana usually came out only when everything had already gone wrong, or when you'd survived long enough to need it. But popular history doesn't love practicality. A beautiful sword is symbolic, dramatic, and easy to sell. A long spear is awkward, hard to pose with, and terrible for merch. So the katana became the soul of the samurai, while bows and spears got demoted to supporting roles. It's like remembering modern warfare by talking only about knives because they look cooler than guns. Real samurai didn't fight to look cinematic. They fought to stay alive, and survival unfortunately rarely looks good on screen. 18. We like to imagine technology as a straight upward line with ancient people sitting embarrassingly low on the chart. Then you look at ancient Rome and things get awkward. They had self-healing concrete that modern engineers are still trying to copy. They had underfloor heating that warmed homes from the ground up, while plenty of apartments today are still arguing about the gas bill. They built massive water systems that ran for centuries, no electricity, no apps, and almost never broke. Some Roman structures have outlasted modern buildings with 50-year warranties. The funny part is this: we call them ancient, yet we still haven't fully replicated what they figured out. Roman technology didn't disappear because it was bad. It disappeared because society changed priorities, shifted, and knowledge got lost. Progress, it turns out, isn't always an upgrade. Sometimes it's just forgetting how the old stuff worked. And so 2,000 years later, we stand in front of Roman ruins, half impressed and half confused, wondering how people without electricity managed to build things that people with electricity still don't completely understand. 19. Cleopatra is usually portrayed as a femme fatale who ruled by beauty-manipulated powerful men and ultimately lost because, well, her looks stopped working. It's a convenient story because it turns messy geopolitics into a simple romance anyone can follow. Reality is far less flattering to that narrative. Cleopatra survived on intelligence, not eyeliner. She spoke multiple languages, understood law, controlled Egypt's economy, and played power politics with Rome at the level of states, not dates. Her alliances with Caesar and Antony weren't love stories. They were survival strategies for a kingdom trapped between Roman factions, tearing each other apart. When Rome picked a different winner, Cleopatra lost power not because she became less attractive, but because she backed the wrong side. Unfortunately, defeated by geopolitics doesn't sell as well as defeated by beauty. History loves shrinking powerful women down to their appearance because it's easier than explaining tax systems, naval logistics, and political coalitions. Cleopatra didn't lose because she was a beautiful woman. She lost because Rome was a machine designed to crush anything in front of it, beautiful or not. 20. When people talk about the discovery of the Americas, many still picture ships landing on an empty continent, wild forests, untouched land, not a human in sight, as if the place had just been unboxed. It sounds adventurous, heroic, and very convenient for textbooks. There's just one issue: the Americas were not empty. Long before Europeans arrived, millions of indigenous people were already living there with cities, agriculture, trade networks, and complex societies. Calling this a discovery is like walking into a packed party and announcing, "Wow, I just found this place." But the wording isn't accidental. It turns land seizure into something neutral, sometimes even admirable. Invasion sounds bad. Discovery sounds scientific. Language does the rest. Indigenous people didn't vanish because they weren't there. They vanished because they weren't counted as people in the story, told by those who arrived later. History sometimes doesn't erase presence. It just changes the camera angle until you can't see it anymore. 21. The Renaissance is often told as the moment Europe suddenly woke up from a long nap and said, "Ah, yes, thinking. We invented it again. It's proud, it's clean, and it's very short on citations." In reality, the Renaissance didn't explode out of thin air. It looked more like a major update built on someone else's code. For centuries beforehand, scholars in the Islamic world and across Asia had been preserving, translating, and expanding Greek and Roman mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. When Europe reconnected with this knowledge through trade war and translation, it didn't rediscover the light. It opened the manual. But we learned from others doesn't sell as well as we were suddenly geniuses. So history streamlined the story, cut the middlemen, fast-forward the timeline, and call it the Renaissance. Not because Europe lacked talent, but because nobody likes admitting they got better by borrowing books. History, after all, prefers the garage startup myth to acknowledging there was seed funding involved. 22. The Leaning Tower of Pisa leaned so hard it became a global punchline, and the reflex reaction is always the same. Wow, the builders really messed that up. It's a very modern instinct: if something tilts, blame the design. In this case, though, the design wasn't the problem. The ground was. Pisa was built on soft, unstable soil, and the tower started leaning almost as soon as the first few floors went up. The engineers weren't idiots. They just didn't have modern geotechnical science. The funny part is they actually tried to fix it by building the upper levels slightly off-center to compensate, turning the tower into a structure that was literally debugged while running. And somehow it stayed standing for centuries. If this happened today, the project would have been halted, investigated, held in press conferences, and eventually blamed on a subcontractor. History works differently. The tower isn't perfect, it isn't straight, and that's exactly why it's more famous than every well-behaved tower standing upright next to it. Turns out sometimes becoming an icon isn't about doing everything right, it's about leaning in just the right way. 23. Ancient Egyptians are usually imagined as deeply spiritual, mysterious people more into spells than science. Then you look at how they mummified bodies and realize something slightly awkward. They understood the human body extremely well. Not in a vague mystical way, but in a very practical one, knowing exactly what to remove first, how to treat it, so the body wouldn't rot, and repeating the process for thousands of years. When you do something long enough, it stops being a ritual and starts looking a lot like vocational training. They believed the heart mattered more than the brain spiritually, but they also knew exactly where the brain was, so they could pull it out through the nose. That's not random superstition. That's anatomical experience at an industrial scale. While Europe centuries later was still hesitant to dissect bodies for religious reasons, ancient Egypt had people who practiced treating it like an assembly line. The irony is that they didn't call themselves anatomists because they thought they were serving the gods. History later labeled them mystical, when in reality they were doing something modern science knows very well, learning by doing, then doing it thousands of times. 24. Knights in stories are always polite, noble protectors of the weak, fighting for honor and bowing respectfully before drawing their swords. It's clean, inspiring, and perfect for bedtime stories. Real life was less poetic. Most knights were armored mercenaries fighting for moneyland or a lord who promised to pay on time. Honor existed, sure, but it usually came after the contract. If the lord was rich, powerful, and winning loyalty was rock solid. If the lord ran out of money or started losing honor, suddenly became flexible. That doesn't make knights villains. It makes them human. Medieval warfare wasn't a moral stage. It was a dangerous labor market where combat skills were exchanged for survival. But history prefers noble knights to practical ones because the noble version looks better on a wall. So a complex military class got shrink-wrapped into a moral symbol. And the messy reality was pushed aside because it reminds us of something uncomfortable. Even the shiniest armor was usually paid for in cash. 25. The Mongol Empire is usually remembered as a horseback nightmare. Arrive fast, kill, efficiently leave ashes behind. That image isn't wrong, but it's only the trailer. The part that gets far less screen time comes after the conquest, when the Mongols did something deeply uncinematic. They managed and connected. They built a trade network stretching from East Asia to Europe, protected routes, standardized laws, and let goods, technology ideas, and yes, even diseases move faster than ever before. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road worked so well that merchants could travel farther, quicker, and safer than in previous centuries. It starts sounding less like a barbarian horde and more like a global logistics company. The Mongols didn't care what you believed or where you came from as long as taxes were paid and trade kept moving. Their empire functioned like a system, expanded through violence, maintained through commerce. But history prefers remembering the slaughter over the operations because they built an efficient trade network doesn't shock quite like they wiped out a city. And so one of the largest connective systems in human history gets reduced to the sound of galloping hooves. 26. Ancient Africa often gets lumped into a single blurry image, poor, underdeveloped, always trailing behind the rest of the world. It's a very convenient simplification because it lets a lot of uncomfortable facts quietly disappear. For centuries, empires like the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, and the Great Zimbabwe were wealthy beyond belief, controlling gold salt and transcontinental trade routes. Timbuktu was once a major intellectual hub, where scholars exchanged books, law, theology, and science not orally but through actual libraries. None of this gets much airtime because it doesn't fit the familiar story of a backward continent. When history is written from the perspective of those who arrive to conquer, the achievements of the conquered tend to become invisible. Africa didn't lack civilization, it lacked storytellers standing close enough to the microphone. And so an entire continent got repackaged as background scenery for someone else's narrative, while its accomplishments were treated as rare exceptions. Turns out backward isn't always a condition. It's often just a label someone else sticks on you. 27. Mansa Musa is the kind of historical figure that makes the concept of rich feel slightly ridiculous. He wasn't just wealthy, he distorted markets. During his pilgrimage to Mecca, Mansa Musa carried so much gold and gave it away so generously that gold prices collapsed everywhere he passed, taking years to recover. This wasn't an Instagram flex. This was macroeconomics. The Mali Empire controlled the world's most important gold and salt routes, at the time running trade scholarship in cities like Timbuktu, where books were valued nearly as much as gold. But because this story comes from Africa, it often gets pushed to the footnotes or skipped entirely. Global history prefers its extreme wealth to come from more familiar places. Mansa Musa didn't just break records for personal fortune. He shattered the assumption that Africa was backward. And somehow the richest man in history also became one of the least talked about, not because he lacked gold, but because he lacked a microphone. 28. If there's an award for the most beautifully exaggerated battle in history, it goes to the story of the 300 Spartans. The popular version shows 300 perfectly sculpted men, ABs, glistening, holding off an almost infinite Persian army, and fighting to the last breath for freedom. It's powerful, clean, and ideal post-gym viewing. The less cinematic version is this: they weren't fighting alone. At Thermopylae, thousands of other Greek soldiers were there too, Thespians, Thebans, and a few allies who didn't have Sparta's brand recognition. But 300 guys, plus several thousand teammates, doesn't really sell posters. Enemy numbers were also inflated because defeating an army that's endlessly massive sounds far more heroic than beating one that's merely very large. And when the battle ended, history chose to spotlight the most beautiful sacrifice, while awkward details, bad strategy, betrayal, tactical retreat got neatly wrapped up under the word tragedy. Not because the story is completely false, but because it was edited for emotional impact. History here works exactly like a movie trailer. Cut the long explanations, keep a few intense moments, and then call that the whole story. 29. Christopher Columbus did not leave this world wrapped in the glow of a hero who discovered the New World. While he was alive, he was mostly a headache. He was a poor administrator, constantly clashed with his own men, faced accusations of abuse of power, and eventually was arrested, put in chains, and shipped back to Spain. There were no parades, no statues, just a stack of complaints so annoying that the royal court probably wanted to move on to the next letter. Columbus's voyages did bring land, but they also brought chaos, bureaucratic disasters, and long-term problems the crown had to clean up for years. The image of the great explorer only emerged after his death, when nations needed a neat, inspiring story about expansion and glory. That's when Columbus got edited fewer failures, fewer messes, more ideals. Not because he changed, but because the purpose of the story did. History doesn't always celebrate the most effective people. It celebrates the people who fit the story that needs telling. And that's how a complicated, controversial man got shrink-wrapped into a symbol perfect for naming a holiday and very difficult to argue with afterward. 30. Let them eat cake is the perfect line for pop history, short, sharp, and cruel enough that you don't need to read another chapter. The problem is, Marie Antoinette never said it. The line already existed in satirical writings before she ever set foot in France, used as a stock example of how out of touch aristocrats supposedly were. When the crisis hit, the quote got pulled from storage, slapped onto the right person at the right moment, and that was that. A collapsing financial system, inflation, unfair taxes, and political gridlock all got compressed into one fake sentence. This wasn't an accident. A memorable quote always beats a complicated explanation. Every time it gets repeated, the quote gets stronger, while the truth gets weaker because it takes too long to explain. By the time Marie Antoinette was led to the guillotine, she wasn't just losing to a revolution. She was losing to a version of the story that worked too well. History in the end doesn't preserve what's most accurate, it preserves what's easiest to remember. And sometimes a sentence that was never spoken can do more damage than an entire lifetime ever could.